Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I want to talk about an amendment to a proposed deal that was meant to have taken place, or a law that was put in place where the German government had required any military-aged man between the age, I think, of 17 and 45 that was going to leave Germany for an extended period of time to first notify and get permission from the relevant authorities before doing so. Now, there's been a walk back on that, so without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I'm going to put up a video that I did where the news, when it had broken, I did a video on Germany had asked its fighting age men, I think it was between the age of 17 and 45, that were required to notify and get permission from the relevant authorities if they were planning to leave Germany for an extended period of time. Now, a few takeaways from that were that there was not much public debate over it. It was passed and promulgated. There was not much way of discourse within the public. And I suspect that there must have been a huge backlash from that decision, because it appears that the German government have now walked back on that on that policy that they had enacted. So I've got an article here from the BBC News which says Germany suspends military approval for long stays abroad for men under 45. And I'll just go through it briefly. Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius says men of military age in Germany do not need to report lengthy stays abroad. His statements come after a controversy broke out over the possible consequences of a new law which reintroduced military service in Germany. The Military Service Modernization Act, which came into force on the 1st January, aims to boost defenses following threats from Russia in the aftermath of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In a statement sent to the BBC earlier in April, a Defence Ministry spokesman confirmed that males aged 17 and older were required to obtain prior approval for stays abroad lasting longer than 3 months. The requirement to obtain permission has gone largely unnoticed until it was reported by a German newspaper last week. It is not believed to have been applied. Now, Boris Pistorius from the Social Democrats has told the German press agency DPA that it is introducing an exemption. Whether they are 17 or 45 or anywhere in between, everyone is of course free to travel and currently does not need permission to do so, he said. Lengthy stays abroad will not need to be reported either. During the peacetime, now I'm going to read this out, but I'm going to come back to why this is important. This phrase here is important. During the peacetime period, there will be no permission procedures. We are suspending the permission requirement as long as military service is voluntary, Pistorius said. At the same time, he announced that the appropriate procedures would be established in the event of a crisis. He defended the regulation as a precautionary measure. So that right there is something we're going to discuss. The law that came into force in January brings back conscription in principle, though it will be implemented only if not enough people sign up for the army voluntarily. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz said he wants to create Europe's strongest conventional army. As of January this year, all 18-year-olds in Germany are being sent a questionnaire asking if they are interested and willing to join the armed forces. The questionnaire is mandatory for men and voluntary for women. From July 2027, all 18-year-old men will have to take a medical exam to assess their fitness for possible military service. I'm going to discuss, I mentioned that Pistorius said, and this is what he had to say. At the same time, he announced that appropriate procedures would be established in the event of a crisis. He defended the regulation as a precautionary measure. Now, that word crisis, do you know what that is reminiscent of? Do you recall that when Donald Trump came into power, he had told Angela Merkel under no circumstances will he allow the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to go ahead. He laid down his red line, and that was what he had wanted. Donald Trump then concluded his term. He stood for a second term. Biden defeated him, came into power. The Russiagate scandal had, they say, caused a lot of issues, and that is what tilted the balance in favor of Biden. But nevertheless, when Biden came into power, Biden said something very important, which sounds eerily similar to this. Biden said that he doesn't have a problem with the Nord Stream pipeline going through. It can go ahead. The Nord Stream 2 can go ahead. He has no problem. However, should the Russians invade Ukraine, then it will become a problem. Okay, bear that in mind. Now, he made these comments way before the Russians went into Ukraine. Then, in the run-up to the Russians going into Ukraine, Biden kept saying it's going to happen today. The Russians are invading today. They're going to invade tomorrow, a week from today, 2 weeks from today. And the next thing you know, the Russians went into Ukraine. And at the time when the Russians went into Ukraine, I remember saying to my son, I said, the Americans together with the Europeans and the United Kingdom fomented the circumstances for the Russians to go in. They goaded the Russians into it. Putin fell for it, took the bait and went in. Now, it's going to be up to him to manage what is happening in Ukraine. Because the fallout from that, in terms of social media, is going to be a problem. And a few things happen. The moment the Russians went into Ukraine, the first thing, if you recall, Boris Johnson came out and said, RT is being banned. And I said to my son, the day the government tells you that you can only listen to Sky News, BBC, and Western media and not listen to what the Russians have to say, because in order for a dialogue and a peace settlement to come into play, we need to understand what both sides are saying. The truth lies somewhere in between. But we were not being allowed to access RT because it was a Russian mouthpiece. Now, we know it's a Russian mouthpiece, and that is why it's all the more important for us to be able to access RT at a time when the conflict happened, because we then see what the Russians are saying, what the Kremlin is saying, and somewhere in between we can try and understand what is actually going on. But we were being denied that opportunity, and that there for me was the defining moment, because it said to me, something bigger is happening here and our government doesn't want us to know. If our government was transparent, they would have said to us, this is what the Russians are saying. And they would not have, you see, they wanted to control the narrative. And this is exactly what is happening here. When Boris Pistorius says that they are putting this in abeyance until, if a crisis does emerge, it's so eerily similar to Joe Biden saying, you can go ahead with the Nord Stream 2, but should the Russians invade? Now, what crisis is Pistorius talking about here? And then you see John Healey starting to talk about, while everybody was looking at Iran, the UK, together with its European allies, were monitoring Russian ships and submarines coming into UK waters and our cables being threatened. And do you see the ramping taking place? Do you see the build-up taking place? So we know there is going to be a crisis. A crisis will be manufactured. And the next thing you know, we're going to be at war with the Russians. However, I'm saying to you again, the Europeans are making a big mistake here, and I'll tell you why. They've gone and alienated the United States over what has happened in Iran. Donald Trump has said he will never forget. The American public are fed up with having to bail out the Europeans. The Europeans have now not come to the aid. Now forget about what you think, whether Donald Trump's war in Iran is just, unjust, whether it's legal, illegal, it's immaterial. Because that mother and father in the United States, whether they Democrat, whether they Republican, whether they're pro-war, anti-war, it doesn't matter. They have a stake in what happened in Iran simply because their kids are there on the front line. Now, whether they agree that their kids should be there or not is immaterial. Their kids are there. And if their kids are facing blood, sweat, and tears and the loss of life, and when the Americans ask for help, we deny that help, they then don't look to Donald Trump. They look and say, my child went into battle. My child is now no longer with me. And when we asked for help, you were nowhere to be seen. So this is why I say it's very dangerous, the game the Europeans and the UK are playing, because they've gone out of their way to ostracize and alienate the United States, who is their ally. And this crisis that they are talking about, when it rears its ugly head, whether it is genuine or manufactured, is immaterial. Because the American administration is going to say, I think Europe is a far way away. I think you need to deal with this. And if it's a Ukraine type scenario, Ukraine is not a member of of NATO. So there is the United States are under no compulsion to act, because Article 5 doesn't mean anything in that scenario. And if in a worst case scenario the Americans pull out of NATO altogether and they remove their troops from Europe, you keep threatening that we'll ask you to remove your troops. Fine. What have you got to put up against the Russians should the Americans leave? The Russians are battle hardened. They've been fighting in Ukraine for the last 4 or 5 years. They've been fighting in Africa. They've been fighting in Syria. What has Europe got to put as a form of deterrence to that threat? And I don't mean this in any disrespect towards our armed forces. I think our armed forces are absolutely amazing and brave. However, I think we're sending them in to a gunfight, not even with a knife. We're sending them into a gunfight with a stone, a little pebble. And that is not their fault. That is down to our administration's faults. That is down to the policies we have promulgated in the last 15, 20, 25 years that has resulted in a decapitation of our military. And now we are going and instigating issues all over the world, instigating issues with the Russians and expecting our soldiers, our brave soldiers, to go out and do our dirty work for us. I think that is woefully unfair. I think that is unfair to expect of the soldiers. I think that is unfair to expect of the people, the mothers and fathers that send their kids out to do the bidding on behalf of these bastard politicians. So again, I'm saying to you that this threat that Pistorius talks about is eerily similar to what Biden said. And Biden had foreknowledge of what was going to happen, because if you recall, during the press conference, when the German reporter asked him, Mr. President, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you talk about consequences for the Russians. What are you referring to? How are you going to make sure about the Nord Stream pipeline? And Biden looked smugly on, smiled, grinned like the jackass that he is, and said, "Oh, we have ways." And then when the Ukraine war occurred, what happened? The pipeline got blown up. And these morons would have you believe that the Russians blew up their own pipeline. Vladimir Putin goes and buys this brand spanking new Rolls Royce, and then he blows it up. He's paid for it. It belongs to him. It's his pride and joy, and then he blows it up. That is the morality of the establishments that are currently within the UK and Europe, and the one that you had in the United States. So again, I thought I'll flag this article because I'm telling you something is on the cards here. When this kind of rhetoric comes out of these administrations, There is something bigger at play here. And John Healy talking about, cables being cut and everything. The writing's on the wall. So I want to thank you for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. And please remember to like, share, and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.